Melanoma Matters is an educational resource. The content represents our opinions and does not constitute medical advice. If you're a patient with questions specific to your situation, please consult your medical practitioner. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Melanoma Matters. I'm James Larkin.
And I'm Sapna Patel.
Today, we've got another guest, and we're very fortunate to be joined by Bettina Ryll, who I think also needs no introduction. But nevertheless, Bettina, first of all, thank you for joining us. But it would be great if you could say something about how you got to where you are today. Maybe, you and I have known each other a while, I guess, by way of introduction, and then we'll just maybe have a bit of a chat about things that we think are important today. So over to you.
Thanks. First, thanks for having me. It's really great. Melanoma Matters, I guess, kind of sums it up for me and what I'm doing most of my life. So I guess I'm here as the founder of the Melanoma Patient Network Europe, and it was definitely not something that I ever had planned on doing with my life. So by background, I'm a physician. I studied medicine in Germany and in France. And then because for a training position, I was wanting to become a surgeon, pediatric surgeon to be precise, I needed a PhD. And this is how I ended up in London at UCL, where I did a PhD in development biology, actually, with molecular biology techniques. And there I met my later husband and had 2 kids. And then this entire plan of my life kind of didn't quite work out the way I thought it would. And I actually had my PhD was on branchial-arch patterning, and that was already about creating heterogeneity out of homogeneous structures. And I got totally sucked into genetic networks and evolution of gene regulation. And that led me then to my postdoc in Sweden, where I still live now. And I started having first a postdoc at Uppsala University in a great group, half paleontologist, half molecular biologist, as nerdy as it gets. Making fluorescent zebrafish. And I probably would still be doing that if my husband hadn't been diagnosed with metastatic melanoma out of nowhere in March 2011. And that was, as you know, the time before we had the great new drugs, and he was dead in less than a year after that. And at the time, there was no European network or patient group or anything. And I think we did just what everyone does. If something like this hits you, you go online and try and find out. And I mean, I didn't even have to go online. I knew what the prognosis of melanoma was. I mean, I'm sure you've also crossed these pathology exams, one of these cancers resistant to any type of therapy. And so that's how we ended up on some US forum. That was really helpful at the time. But there was a group of us, a group of Europeans, and the US forum was just not able to support European patients because they just had no understanding of how our healthcare systems work. And so that's why there was like a small clique of us, and we had people from the UK, some living in Belgium, someone living in the Czech Republic, and we kind of started, supporting each other or just talking, just like looking for options. And that forum already at the time, people started tracking clinical trials and starting reading scientific papers. And this was I was doing for a job. And I could see that people just didn't understand what the science was. And some people were spending enormous amount of money on things that never had a chance to work. And I think this is how it started. It kind of upset me that people would take advantage of patients who were dying. And I just started explaining science. This is how it started. So I always make jokes about it. I was a nerd in residence, and anything I read, I just put on the forum. I started explaining, what is a trial? How does it come across? How do you find one? How do you pick one? Explaining papers. This is how it started. And then there's this small group had started, actually, there were 2 Belgians living in Belgium who had started organizing conferences. And the first conference was just happening at the time of Peter. So Peter was my husband, was diagnosed, and that's when I met James. And not quite so fortunate circumstances. And the second conference was after he was already dead. And then everyone else died, basically. And I was the only one who hadn't been a patient. And I kind of inherited it. I was just not really willing to let all this effort. Patricia and Quentin had already started trying to set up an organization, and that was never my idea. I never wanted a patient organization. I mean, who wants a patient organization? But I was just not willing to let it go to, just let it stop. And it was clear there was need. And I had no idea what to do. And I remember Patricia saying, so we have to meet, we have to get together, we have to kind of talk to each other, we have to find a solution. It was mainly about access. And I really, honestly, I didn't know what to do. And then I just sort of thought we had to meet. I thought, okay, conference. I'd never organized a conference, never written a grant, nothing like that. But this is how it started. And I was just 2013. And it kind of grew from there. And the first thing was then I thought, oh, this is going to be terribly awkward. So we're going to meet as a European bunch in Brussels. No one will know anyone. It is going to be horrendous. So I thought, what about we set up a Facebook group that people can at least introduce each other before we go, and it's going to be hopefully a little bit less awkward. And that kind of became the centerpiece of the entire European network, where we kind of, it continued after that. We started posting science, and then you could realize. But most things just happened afterwards. It wasn't planned. It was just happening. And then you could see that it was helping people. And then I realized that we were just reaching the educated English-speaking ones. And that was something that had upset me from the very beginning, that, this knowledge was only accessible if A, you spoke English, and B, you were medically or scientifically, or ideally both trained, because otherwise it was just as if it didn't exist. And surely this couldn't be right, because, what makes us different or better positioned to have a chance to survive than anyone else? So, and then I realized that this social network behaved a little bit like the gene networks I had been studying. And, if you understand how transcription factors or key regulators work, you kind of understand how social networks work. And then I started tweaking that, because I thought if you put people together who are at least bilingual and who kind of help them to build something in their own network with principles that we know are working, and we put these people together, you don't have to train so many people. You have a handful, you have maybe 30, 40 people, but you impact patients all across Europe. And this became then the idea of the hubs concept. And this is how we still work. So we have like a multi-level organization where you bring, so the next meeting in December is going to be hubs. So these are the active people who run national groups in national language. And this is how it kind of all started.
Bettina, that is,
thanks.
That is so fascinating to hear that origin story, but maybe even more how sort of under the surface or unbeknownst to you, your gene heterogeneity work came into this, patient networking. Yeah. So tell us about MPNE, Melanoma Patient Network Europe now. Where have you taken it? What is the vision that you see for the next 10 years?
So I guess, first, I don't have a vision. Of course, I will always have something that sounds as if I had a strategy. But, if I'm really honest, 5 years is a terribly long time. I didn't have a plan. So we just stuck our nose always very, very, very cleanly on where the biggest issue in our community were. So if you have patient forums, what we are sentinels for issues. We had the first side effect before anyone else had them. We had access issues, drug shortages. We knew of them before others had picked them up, just because that's what people post. People are upset. People are worried. That's what they post on social media. Yeah. We're not representative, and we've never tried to be, but we're good sentinels. So we pick things up. And only the thing we've been basically doing is we've been tracking issues. So it started with clinical trial designs. Regulatory approval wasn't such a big thing because the drugs were so good that even the most critical person couldn't deny that it worked. HTA was a disaster, reimbursement was a disaster, utilization was a disaster. So we kind of really followed just issues coming along, and you learn as you go along. And once you figure it out that, it's not as easy that there is a bad guy sitting somewhere whom you can blame for everything and you turn that person around and everything will be solved. That's not how this works. So we kind of got into implementation, and from there into complex systems and how you change complex systems. And now people come to us asking for implementation. Knowledge on implementation. How do you get something into a healthcare system? What do you have to think of? Mm-hmm. Where can you expect issues? So this is kind of how it worked. And where we are right now, we've become more systematic in looking at issues. We started a little bit like as sentinels, picking things up, and we still do that. But now we're starting, for example, going into patient pathways. If you systematically map like a customer pathway, but you do patient pathway, and you do this as saturation. So you do it again and again and again and again until you pick up nothing new anymore. This is what qualitative science does. So we are trying to apply these approaches to pick up what matters to our community. And, you get a very granular, picture of what matters to people, what impacts them. And then you can turn this into a strategy. So now we're kind of course, my heart is in advanced melanoma. So this is how I ended up in this space. And I will probably always be in that space. But if you look at, we have now, I mean, I don't have to tell you that, we have now options for adjuvant or rather neoadjuvant treatment. We're now going into stage 2. So there are different issues coming up, and we've now developed strategies working on these different issues. So I think it's pretty safe to say that also in 5 years, we're just going to track what matters most to patients and do our best to really understand it. Because, I mean, I am just one person, me, myself, and I'm not very representative. So, it doesn't matter what I think. It's more capturing what matters to the community to really be able to inform the next steps. So we're doing something now, right, for example, on ethnography and a European project to get some, depth into understanding what matters to people that we get out of this opinion,
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're going to be doing.
Go on, Sapna. I've got something to say, but you go first.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking how parallel this is to how we approach just the hard sciences, right? I mean, you're doing much more population behavioral approach to these patient networks, but we approach it similarly in the sense that we're iterative. You kind of might have a starting point, but based on the feedback you get, you iterate and you adapt yourself. So we do adaptive trial designs and things like that. And also this saturation method you were talking about. I mean, we use Bonferroni statistics often to do that same when you do repeated sampling on a sample size. Anyway, I think that's fascinating that there's actually a parallel between these patient networks. I'd never thought of it that way.
I mean, I'm a trained scientist.
Can't take the scientists out of
it. You don't go far from that thinking. It's just helpful. You just want to protect yourself from making stupid assumptions or, barking up the wrong tree. So I think that's something I care about. Anyway.
So what I was going to say, I mean, without wishing to embarrass you too much, Bettina, is I think you're pretty much unique. I can't think of anyone else who has such a deep understanding of the clinical, of the science, of the regulatory stuff, of the reimbursement, and actually the experience as well, for which patients have, and globally, that's very unusual set of skills and experience to have in one person, never mind your ferocious energy, which is obvious even talking to you now. So, but what I wanted to sort of ask you, I mean, there's just so much that you've seen and done in the last 5 or 10 years. And what are the bits where, you think that actually the door, you don't need to push on it too hard for us as a community to make a real difference? And then, if I may, in as much as you feel comfortable, what are the areas where you think a lot of time and energy has gone into them without that much to actually show for it, that's sort of helped patients or helped us as a field? Maybe that's a really difficult double-pronged question, but you're kind of at the coalface here, or the interface between lots of different areas in a way that I don't really think anyone else is. We can also cut for a bit.
Well, let's start with the easier, like for the easy bit. So, I guess one, I know this is might sound really stupid, but I think something that I've learned since starting this. So first, it wasn't my plan. I just started because I was medically trained. I had thought I had understood what medicine was about, and I started med school at 19. So we go directly after school into university, and I had probably this very naive idea that I would be making a difference for people. And then I'd been scientifically trained, and the UK is fantastic when it comes to scientific training. UCL is a fantastic place to be. So I had thought what science was about, but then being at the receiving end was just horrifying. And I think that is the driver to the current day. That's something that, I was just not willing to believe that. Well, first I was shocked at my own naivety, but at the same time, I thought that many people around me weren't going to work just like to hurt some patients. That wasn't the intention. So I couldn't believe that a system was so effed up and we were not fixing it. And I guess in a way, that's still what drives me today. I'm not believing that we can't do better. So that's one thing. And then when you start in it, I think that systems at the same time are like easier and harder to move at the same time. I think most people are just spending too much energy on the wrong stuff. So you have to spend quite a bit of time trying to understand. And just, most people aren't bad intended. That's the first thing. There's no single bad person in there. So it's understanding where one has to spend more time. But once you have understood how the system works, often the solutions aren't so terribly hard. So getting to the point is where you spend the effort. But then lots of things are not particularly hard. One just has to do them. So I think there's action and, trusting your gut in a way that when things are not right, not just simply to accept them, but do something about it. I think that's the easy. It's not so hard. Once you're at that point, it's not so hard. It's changing the mind or the frame, which is more work. So, I found in the end, and that's one of the reasons why I actually left my position at university. I mean, there were different reasons for that as well, but I just couldn't, glowing zebrafish were great when life is great. But after Peter died, I just thought, I haven't spent all that time learning and studying. And then, just like I could see that I could make a real difference for people. And I just couldn't, with my own conscience, I just couldn't keep doing something that I very much enjoyed privately, but, they had no bigger impact. I couldn't do that. But it was like, it felt like once you know how the system moves, you see it moving. And that is probably something that many people miss. I started out, when something like this happens, you feel like a victim. We are not a victim of our circumstances. We all have much more power and much more influence than we think we have. And it's just using that I think is the easy bit. The tricky bit. So how much time do you have?
Hang on. Before you go on to that, you said spending too much time on the wrong stuff. So What's the wrong stuff? One or two examples. Again, in as much as you feel comfortable saying in public.
So it's like, well, I'm worried about that for a long time. This might sound now really cheesy, but just like, I don't know whether you had that when you were at school. We had these little booklets where you would give it to your friends and your teachers, and they would write something in it and then stick these pictures on the other side or some stickers. I don't know what it's called in English, actually. But I used to have one of those. And my primary school teacher wrote something in it that I didn't know was part of the Serenity Prayer. But I remember really that her handwriting, I can still see it in front of me. And then I threw it away when I was, a teenager, and thought this kind of stuff was utterly embarrassing and uncool. But for some reason, it had really stuck what she had written. And it was really like, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And for some reason, after Peter was, I don't know, it never, maybe because it's so odd to write this to a 7 or 8-year-old. I don't know why I remembered it, but it really got me through this difficult time when Peter got sick and then died, because it's just like, I would just like, when I was stuck, I would just repeat it to myself, and I would just think like, what can I change? What can't I change? How do I know the difference? Sometimes you don't know whether you can until you test it. So you have to try something, and then you just observe what's happening. And then you oddly see that often stuff moves. And we just pay too much attention that we think that it has to move our way. Often stuff doesn't move our way. You just have to start and see. And then you see what is moving. You realize where the levers are, where the wriggle room is, where the cracks are. And that is, I think, what, and I don't do much more. You give it a tick, you see what happens, you reinforce what's working. It's not magic. It's not, rocket science, but it's keeping at it, which changes things, I think, over time.
You said it a couple of times now. This idea that it's easier or more effective to act your way into thinking differently than to think your way into acting. If you sat back and said, well, let me think of, and let's figure out the way through these regulatory hurdles or these network issues, you can think yourself into inaction. But if you just say, let me just start doing things, and like you said, let me see where things will give and where they won't give, then you change your thinking based on the results you see. So kudos for
Actually, this is actually, in a way, it's actually consistent. I now know this in hindsight, but if you look at the change of complex adaptive systems, which we are, society is a complex adaptive system. You can look what the Cynefin framework is saying, for example. If you look at change theory of complex systems, that's exactly what they say. You have to trigger, and then you have to see, and you observe, and then you reinforce what you want, and you try to block the things you don't want. But I didn't know that. But if you've done any biology research, biology works that way. You have this great theory, your supervisor explains to you when you start your PhD, and then you do the first experiment, and nothing works the way you thought. And then you just come up with a nice theory until you repeat the theory. Anyone who works in biology or biological systems is familiar that our ideas are often not working. And then you just adapt your theory, right? anything works like that. Complex adaptive systems behave. Biology is complex adaptive. Society is complex adaptive. It's not, it's an approach to thinking about it and not being so stuck up with your own ideas about how things should be. I think that's probably, makes your life a bit, you sleep at night if you do work like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the biggest things you think we're doing badly wrong, or is the list too long, Bettina?
Well, I mean,
is that a personal question, James, or is that a professional broad question?
Come on.
What do you think of wardrobe choices and things like that? Just kidding.
Well, I have, I was like, I do tend to have opinions on stuff, and that's rather well known, I guess. So I think something that personally frustrates me in the melanoma space, or a little bit larger, and we've talked about this at great length, is this approach to immunotherapy that I just think it's so horrendously backwards. And it's slowly getting better, but that's something that, it's like we've had that since the first, if you remember the first response curves under IPI, right? If we remember what they look like, this drop and the plateau. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in anything to realize it's two different types of populations, right? Some don't respond and some respond, and those who respond live. I mean, that's not particular rocket science. And then to look at it, that a medium does not describe this accurately, that either you benefit or you don't benefit, a median is not capturing this. And then I've been making so many jokes about it that I'm tired of my own jokes about this magical biomarker, 42, the answer to the universe. There's one biomarker to catch them all. I mean, it's terrible how we've been trying, since we had the first checkpoint inhibitors, we've been trying to find this one single thing that explains and predicts response. And I mean, okay, fair enough. I've spent years in evolution. If you look at how the immune system evolved, already sponges have an immune system. So, our immune system is slightly more complex than a sponge's immune system, and it has to be. So to expect that 42 is the answer to the immune system is just, from an evolution perspective, it just makes no sense whatsoever. So we should have from the beginning expected it to be different and expected to be complex and have approached it as a complex system. And now we are finally, eventually, potentially getting there, but I'm still, we know that you have to have different components in place and probably in the right order, the right timing, the right concentration, and what else in order to produce a response. And if we have a patient who survives, it has worked, but we haven't understood why. If it doesn't work, absence of response is not a unifier. So it has many different reasons. And I would have liked to have more, more science, more immunology earlier on. And I think that is my hope, actually, what we're hopefully getting now finally. Have a more, start with an hypothesis, because it will be a hypothesis, but a more complex hypothesis, and design our trials going forward to highlight these factors and these hypotheses and systematically test it out. I'm sure you've sat in the same session as Moa, where Christian presented his ideas about, how we escalate patients without cold tumors and what we do with the cold hot. And so I think something like this is much more appropriate for the complexity behind there. So that's something that has frustrated me for a long time, because we see people survive and we haven't been really smart about doing something for those who don't. So I think that was one, on that side of thing. Something on the system level, and that's not something I don't know, whether it's not just a medical issue, it's how we deal with innovation in general. Because we're now seeing with uveal melanoma similar, like a repetition of what we had when we got IPI back in the days for cutaneous melanoma, that there's something, everyone says we need options for these patients who have nothing, but then if something comes, somehow the system doesn't know what to do with it. So the adoption of the first therapy in a high unmet need situation is always terrible. So maybe because we compare it to something that was dirt cheap, didn't work, people died, but at least it was dirt cheap. So we're trying to have something that, of course, would be more expensive. So I don't know, but it seems it's a second time. It's a repetition of the same argumentations that we had back. We don't have long-term OS. Yeah, but people are dying now. It's like, we could probably just search our forums and recycle the arguments we used back then. But it's like that, I think, as society, we're not getting right. Our people are dying and we are spending time on discussions that we should have expected to come. So that's something that I think needs to change. And of course, there's lots of, the financial issues, how we pay for drug development. So this is maybe going too far now, but that's something I'm spending time now on top of other things. But these are maybe my two bugbears right now. I have many more, but
Yeah. I wonder how many people listening even realize that kind of what you're alluding to, Bettina, Tebentafusp is not available in the UK. Despite leading the trials, Paul Nathan having his fingerprint all over that data, what is that about? What is happening at the approval end that, now coming on 2 years from a US approval, there is no approval in the UK? What's stopping it? And I recognize you alluded to it. It's cost and long-term benefit. So the alternative is these patients don't have access and they're dying?
Yet. I mean, it's like this is now a very long discussion. Now, I'm no economist by training, but I've been always, it just intrigued me that we are stuck at the same spot over and over again. Yeah. And just like if a system doesn't change, then someone must be benefiting from it, right? Otherwise, the system doesn't change. Change. If something is not benefiting anyone, systems change. So I was intrigued to kind of, who benefits from this? And of course, it's easy, pharma, the bad guys. I mean, they do enough that warrants that anyway. So, it's like easy to keep that scapegoat alive. But if you then really start looking, I was just intrigued by this phenomenon that, and we have like these and I think the medical community, that's another bugbear, by the way. At the moment, it seems saving money seems to be very fashionable among oncologists. If you it's like we have like some, comments on that. Maybe if you don't have a really cool research idea, you can always run a trial to save money. Do the same for less, and pretend it's research. So from a patient perspective, I have honestly zero understanding for that. Because first, I think, who went to med school to save money? I don't know, maybe you should have done something else with your life. So that's one thing. But then also it doesn't improve outcomes. It just, especially the designers we're currently having, it just shifts the same problem, the variance in the patient population, just for less money. So the motivation is not even to be better for patients. It's just like, anyway. So, but I was interested in, who kind of, who keeps this alive. So I wanted kind of digging into it. And if you then look at who benefits from, for example, pharmaceutical shares, and then you look into how holds shares. And there was the Oslo Medicines Initiative that did some policy work. Actually, it's still on the online on the platform. I really recommend that. It turns out, for example, our pension funds hold pharma shares. And now I was on an investor meeting where, for example, insurers themselves invest into pharma while telling us the drugs are too expensive. So you kind of all of a sudden start thinking, ooh, this isn't quite as easy as I thought. And then if you then read a bit broader than just your medical stuff and look, for example, into, economies, like I live in a small country now. If you Sweden has 10 million people and you see like the links between industry policy, healthcare system, it's much more obvious than when you live in a large country, because it's very clear that the money has to come in from somewhere. And you see that the argumentation is much closer to, if you can't pay it, it will not happen. While in larger countries like Germany or the UK, it's easier to separate these discussions and have them with different audiences and pretend they don't interlink, but they obviously do. So if you look at what countries have often in strategies in parallel, it's mind-boggling. So everyone wants to have pharmaceutical industry because you can make lots of money. It's good for your GDP. They create a lot of income per employee, for example. They create jobs. Everyone wants that. Now comes all this resilience, autonomy, whatever, in the current geopolitical climate. On the other side, everyone tells you your healthcare system is not sustainable. And it's basically at some point you have to realize that these things are just mutually exclusive. So you can't have the cake and eat it. And I don't have a solution to it. It was like a really smart, I read an article and I can't remember the name of the person, unfortunately, but it was an economist, I think from Harvard, who said that who pointed out put it quite well in a way that he said this is like, so we have conditions for which there are no treatments. And then we have treatments for conditions, but then patients don't get it because of the price. And he said, by trying to make one of the problems better, we make the other worse. And I think that's very, very true. We put incentives to develop drugs for conditions for which we have nothing, after which they are so expensive that the patients who need them don't get them. So it's this kind of, you're on the balance where whatever you do, you lose. So I don't have a solution to it, but what I want a discussion, and what I want is, for us as society, because it affects so much across. If our pension's in there, we don't want to have our granny on the street either. So it has to be, it has to have, there's just something in the system that is misaligned. And at the moment, the misalignment means that our patients are dying, and that cannot be the price. So there has to be some kind of reformation, some kind of change, that we end up with a system that patients who have no other chance actually have access, while the other interests are still taken into account. As I said, I don't want to see my granny in the street. I was like, I'm sure it is, but it's not so easy. It's not just saying it's them and then make them bad. It's not as simple as that.
No, but as you started this whole conversation, you said to some degree, it's just taking an action and looking at the reaction or the response. I was at University of Michigan a week or so ago giving a lecture, and then they took me to a dinner that evening. It was their alumni day, though I'm not an alumni there. And we were eating, my sister and I were eating with the group. We went to the football game the next day, and the head of their ophthalmology department said, I don't know if you've noticed, but last evening there was no beef on the menu. And we said, oh yeah, that's right. It was fish, chicken, vegetable were the options. And he said, it's a small move, but the student group here said, the impact of big agriculture industry on environmental change is so large, we can no longer ignore it, predominantly the beef industry. So at catered events for the university, it may only be in the Department of Ophthalmology, or maybe no beef as an option. And it's a small move, it was subtle. Hardly any of us, I think, noticed it or had a problem with it, but it's a small move that if they then trickle that, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I could do something like that in Colorado. Small move, you wonder if you could start talking to these pension plans and say, look, could we do a simple thing where we just don't do the investment with pharma companies? Let's just do that for a year or two, see the impact. Obviously it's a big financial impact, but it's like taking a move. Who's going to be brave enough to start the conversation to make the move, so that there might actually be a ripple effect and some change here?
Yeah, the other thing I would say is the complexity here as well. There aren't easy stories and sound bites or 140 characters a lot of the time. And but this is, we're heading way off. Well, not way off, but, at the end of the day, a lot of what's out there in the kind of public domain is relatively superficial stuff, adopting positions without knowing much about it, who shouts loudest, all that sort of stuff, frankly. Whereas guess what, as you say, Bettina, in these complex systems, actually, there's going to be all sorts of linkages here that we know about, and there's loads that we don't know about as well. And there aren't really going to be any simple things here. And it's going to be about understanding them, which, are we equipped to do that? Yes, probably, but it requires effort. Go on.
I just think, I think it's also, in the end, it's about knowing what you stand for. It's not about having the answers. It's about having the right questions and knowing where you draw the line in the sand. Just like I believe that letting people die while we have the drugs and just we can't figure out how to finance that or change the system in a better way is not okay. We don't produce drugs to make non-patients rich. That's what the system is currently doing. That's sick.
Yeah.
So, it's as simple as that. Just like, I don't know how to solve it, but we're not going to die just because someone can't, figure out how to solve this. And I've said the same about clinical trial design. Just like, I don't want to see phase 3s with differences like this, where everyone at ASCO stands like this and you go, this is a phase 3 that should have never happened. Just think about it. If you find a huge difference in a phase 3, it's two things. Either you were too stupid to pick it up in a phase 2 that there was a huge difference, and you need a phase 3 to find it out, in which case I really question your ability to run clinical trials. Or you knew from the very beginning there was a huge difference, and you run an unethical trial from day one. That's why it's probably also blinded, usually. And then, of course, there comes all this waxing about, scientific and blah, 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 double blind, triple blinded, whatever. So that's just not why we invented RCTs. If you go back to the very end, I did some digging. It was to pick up small, so minor to medium differences, not huge differences. And people fell in love with the technique and totally forgot why we're doing it in the first place. And does it matter whether a drug is 52.3% or 49.73% better? It makes no difference clinically. I mean, if you remember this PD-L1 discussion we've had in melanoma, well, whatever, whether you're PD-L1 high or low, it makes no difference. Immunotherapy is still better than the next best option. So, we're wasting time on something that clinically makes no difference what you put your patient on. So the moment it makes a difference in clinical decision-making, fine. But if it doesn't, we're wasting a lot of trying to be accurate in a system that's complex adaptive, never mind. And, there's something in there that I think, we've been on the other side. Peter was actually on 2 trials and 1 early access problem. And I find it problematic to tell patients they should be on a trial that I would not want to be on myself. I can tell you that randomization on that trial that is on my personal top 3 of worst events in my life, together with his diagnosis of stage 4 out of nowhere and his death. And the randomization is just in the middle of that. So that's not how we should be treating people. And of course, the data is easier to interpret, but are we willing to throw people under the bus just because we can't figure out something better? I think that is these lines where one has to take a position, even if you don't know how to fix it. But at some point, we must be standing for something. And then the funny thing is, for example, I got approached by an investor of all people. Investor, really. And they had the same issue, for example, and their argumentation was like that the investments in pharma are apparently not as interesting as they used to be because many countries don't pay for the drugs anymore. And there are now discussions about rather making money over volume. And then I mentioned that to someone who understands this type of stuff, because that's not my background. And they were like, yeah, if you really want to make money, you have to go over volume, not over unit price. And you go, what do you mean? So it's even a non-economic principle, apparently. And you go, why can't we have that instead? So, I don't think that we have to have the answers as medics or from our background, but we have to have a position on what is acceptable and what's not. And then put pressure on the system to find a solution that they can figure out, but that meets our criteria. So I think that's more, where we're standing right now. And the odd thing is usually something happens if you know what you want. And then the other side often goes, yeah, sure. It's so often it has happened. I had it at a conference where I had someone from EMA on the podium and someone from HDA. And I said, it's because of you, our people die on these trials. That was not so politically smart. It took some time to fix that, but, I've learned a little bit. That was my first conference, actually. But then afterwards, everyone agreed that this was not the way to do it. And I had in my mind, these were the bad guys because they are the problem. And they were sitting there, I was like, no, we don't need these trials. I'm not sure that's true, but, it's like, so there is often more space for maneuver or change than we think there is. So that's one of these things, I've been busy with recently.
Okay, so listen, we could talk for hours.
No, we can't. No one's going to listen to that.
No, don't be silly. But we probably do need to wrap up because we're coming up to sort of 40 minutes. That was an absolute tour de force. I don't even know where to start, actually, other than to say that anyone who's listening, you need to check out Bettina, what she's doing, what she's done, and and listen to what she's saying, because there's just so much, I think, in there for all of us who don't necessarily think about these things in the way that you do and have been. So, Bettina, it's really kind of you to give us 40 minutes of your time. Really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me. But just to say, it's not just me. It's just like, that wouldn't be fair. There's such a huge group of people who are spending a lot of time and effort. No one can do this alone. So it has been a huge learning curve. But anyway, thanks for having me.
Well, pleasure. It's very modest of you to say that. I know, it is true. It's all about communities and teams. But, your energy is extraordinary. It just is. Right. So I think we're done. Sapna, anything else to say?
No, other than a huge thank you, Bettina. This was such a great conversation. I agree. We could actually talk for hours and probably should, because there's more to do.
Okay. Take care. See you soon.
See you soon, everyone. Bye.
Bye.